c'è rimasto il fratello.
Good morning. Funziona? My talk, Damn It on Inference, is divided into 6 short parts. The first 5 parts are mainly expositive and interpretative. Only the last part contains some critical remarks in agreement with some lines of thought that I have developed in my previous works. And in the first part, I make this assertion that a certain notion of inference plays a pivotal role in Michael Dammett's thought. A certain notion of inference, there are many notions of inference in the literature, so I call this the relevant notion of inference. Why does it play a pivotal role? Because for Dammett, a notion of inference is necessary for the theory of meaning. He often makes claims like the following: any adequate theory of meaning must recognize that the sense of many statements is such that inference must play a part in any process which leads to their verification. Here Dammett is speaking in general about any theory of meaning. So there are theories of meaning of many kinds: truth conditional, verificationist, falsificationist, pragmatist, realist and anti-realist, but they all must recognize a fact. The fact that the sentences of our language are linked by various inferential connections, and that a grasp of the sense of a sentence involves an apprehension of at least some inferential connections. And here Dammett highlights a connection between inference and sense. So the idea is that in order to grasp the sense of the majority of our sentences, we have to be aware of the possibility of some inferences. So these inferences are meaning constitutive, because sense is the epistemic core of meaning. To understand a sentence is to know its meaning, and the sense of an uttered sentence is the central ingredient of its meaning, so its specific epistemic content. And Dammett says it characterizes the kind of sense which many sentences of our language possess, that we learn to use them precisely in connection with manipulation of other parts of language, that is to say, as capable of being established only via deductive or inductive inferences. Deductive or inductive. So clearly some so inference is meaning constitutive, and any theory of meaning must acknowledge this fact. But inference in what sense? So there are many notions of inference, and so in the second part I try to pinpoint certain salient features of the relevant notion of inference. The basic character of inferences in this sense is that they are linguistic acts. In particular, they are intentional acts. So an inference in this sense is not an event or a process that a subject undergoes. Something that happens to the subject beyond his or her voluntary control. On the contrary, it is something that an agent does. So relevant inferences are intentional acts of passing from certain premises to a certain conclusion. they are conscious, they are linguistic, of course, because premises and conclusions are linguistic utterances. They are rational in this sense. This has to do with the relation between premises and conclusion. This is not an abstract relation, it is not a merely causal relation, it is a rational relation in the sense that the agent takes the premises rationally to support the conclusion. So we have these 4 features, and then there is another feature we have already seen. So that relevant inferences are deductive or inductive, conclusive or non-conclusive. Dummett focuses on deductive inferences, and I too will focus on deductive inferences in the sequel, but he clearly acknowledges that for many sentences the meaning constitutive inferences are non-conclusive. The 6th feature is that relevant inferences are primarily unformalized linguistic acts. This is clear in this passage. We are concerned with inference in informal or at least unformalized reasoning in everyday life, in the law courts, in political argumentation, in scientific literature, in mathematical proofs, and elsewhere. The dots indicate that I have omitted part of this quotation, and this leads us to the next salient feature, which is this, that relevant inferences are implicitly guided by some rule. The full passage is this: we are concerned with principles or rules of inference as they are actually observed in the course of informal reasoning. So the idea is that the agent, in performing the individual inference, is somehow aware of a rule and observes the rule. They are rules of which the speaker may be said to be in some degree aware, of which he has at least implicit knowledge. Mostly implicit knowledge, because they are mostly informal inferences. So, in the individual inference, the speaker somehow implicitly recognizes a particular case of a rule. So, discerns in the rule a general pattern. And this is very important for Dummett. The fundamental idea is that inference involves the discernment of a pattern. We will see that this is very important, this notion of a pattern. And here there is a link with logic, because according to Dummett, well, first let us formulate this 7th salient feature in full. Relevant inferences are implicitly guided by some rule which involves the recognition of a pattern. What about logic? Well, the patterns of deductively valid inferences are made explicit, represented, and studied by formal logic. And that is why Dummett thinks that the beginning of logic is with Aristotle, because Aristotle was the first who made the patterns of some deductive rules explicit. So in the next part, in the 3rd part, I try to summarize Dummett's views concerning the relations between deductive practice, logic, and theory of meaning. As I said, Dummett focuses on deductive inferences. And he has in mind the line of demarcation. Deductive inferences are inferences that aim at deductive validity. And as usual, he characterizes deductive validity in terms of truth preservation. So deductively valid inferences preserve truth. And from this, he draws a consequence concerning theories of meaning, which is this. A theory of meaning, always this is a theory of meaning in general, needs a notion of truth as that which is guaranteed to be transmitted from premises to conclusion of a deductively valid argument. Why? One could ask, why a principle concerning deductive validity has a consequence concerning a theory of meaning, so a theory of linguistic understanding? Because Dummett thinks that a theory of meaning should explain linguistic activities in this sense. It should make linguistic activities intelligible as rational activities based on motives and intentions. And so, deductive practice is a linguistic activity that aims at deductive validity. And therefore, the theory of meaning must, in a way, account for deductive validity. More in particular, the idea is that the theory of meaning must relate the practice of deductive inference to the model of meaning which it employs. So a theory of meaning is centered on a central thesis concerning the meaning of sentences. To understand a sentence is to know a truth condition, and this is a truth condition of theory of meaning. To understand a sentence is to know a verification condition, this is a verificationist theory of meaning, and so on. And deductive practice should be explained starting from this central thesis concerning the meaning and the understanding of sentences. How? Now I try to reconstruct, so this is a very simplified picture of Dammett's view on this. First, at the bottom we have deductive practice, where we accept individual inferences as valid. We accept them in deductive practice because we implicitly discern some patterns. And logicians make these patterns explicit. They devise rules of inference. But the rules appear valid because we know that there are some instances of these rules. But this is far from being a proof that they are valid, because rules cover infinitely many inferences. Anyway, logicians devise rules of inference since Aristotle. Since Frege and Hilbert, they do something more. They collect fixed sets of precisely specified rules of inference and define formal systems for formal languages. And some of these formal systems codify logical reasoning, and they are what a formal system of this kind is what Dammett calls a logical theory. So this is an upward movement from deductive practice to the formal system. Then there is a downward movement starting from the theory of meaning. The theory of meaning is a general theory of linguistic understanding, and it contains a theory of the meaning of the logical constants. Those words or phrases that, by means of which we can construct compound sentences. And on the basis of the theory of meaning of the logical constants, one can develop a semantic theory, a mathematical theory that defines logical consequence. So, mathematical notion, which is a kind of mathematical analysis of the relation of truth preservation in terms of the meanings of the logical constants, or if you like, in terms of logical form, in virtue of logical form. So, the theory of meaning underlies a genuine semantic theory, according to Dammett. Then, one usually defines the validity of an inference in terms of logical consequence, the deductive, the logical validity of an inference, by saying that an inference is logically valid if and only if the conclusion is a logical consequence of the premises. And then one can show that the forms of inferences codified in the formal system are logically valid. And this is a proof of soundness. So one can say that the proof of soundness validates the formal system. This is a very simplified picture, because all these layers, deductive practice, formal system, semantic theory, theory of meaning, all are subject to criticism. So there is a very complex interplay, but I cannot go into details now concerning this interplay. If you like, we can talk about it in the discussion. The most important question now is this, that suppose that a plausible theory of meaning underlies a semantic theory, and that the semantic theory explains how our deductive inferences preserve truth in virtue of the meanings of the logical constants. So, on the basis of the theory of meaning and the semantic theory, we show that our standard deductive practices are logically valid in virtue of the meaning of the logical constants. And then, is this a sufficient explanation of deductive practice? For Dammett, The answer is no, it is not. It is not. Why? Because an explanation of deductive practice must fulfill two requirements. This is clear in the justification of deduction, the paper, the justification of deduction. This is a quotation from that paper. First, to show that the rules of inference we ordinarily employ are in fact valid, that is, that truth is preserved. This is, of course, what is accomplished by a proof of soundness. But this is only the first. The second is to exhibit deductive inference as being useful as well as legitimate. So it's not sufficient to show that our standard deductive inferences are valid. We must show that deductive practice is an intelligible rational activity, and this implies that we have to show that it is useful and legitimate. And this is the fourth part, the problem of deductive inference, I call it. So this problem is highlighted in the justification of deduction. And he says, this is the problem of how deductive argument is possible at all. So why is there this practice? And Dammit thinks that in order to explain how it is possible, we must explain how it is possible that it is both useful and legitimate. But this is a problem because there is a tension. The existence of deductive inference is problematic because of the tension between what seems necessary to account for its legitimacy and what seems necessary to account for its usefulness. Many philosophers have thought that if a deductive inference is legitimate, then knowledge of the truth of the conclusion is already contained in knowledge of the truth of the premises. So when we know the truth of the premises, we already know the truth of the conclusion, and the inference is useless. But Dammit thinks one should investigate this problem more in depth. So this is the problem. How can a deductive inference be both legitimate and useful? And to understand this, we have to understand these two words. What is legitimacy and what is usefulness? Now I address myself to the second question, usefulness. Well, clearly, if an inference is useful, it is useful to a person. So there must be some relation between the inference and the person. An inference I is useful only if the person is in the right relation to I. And let us provisionally call this relation appreciating. The relation of appreciating. Then usefulness in Dammit's sense seems to be this. An inference I is useful if and only if, by appreciating I, a person acquires new knowledge to the effect that the conclusion is true. And so, this is the fruitfulness of deduction. The fact that epistemic advance is effected deductively. For Dammit, this is a fact that is abundantly shown by mathematical deductions. But the problem is to show how this fact is possible. But before coming to the Dammit's solution, we have to understand better the problem. So here in this formulation of usefulness, there are two words that we haven't explained, appreciating and new knowledge. So now I ask, in what sense is a knowledge of the truth of the conclusion new? And, well, the first approximation is this. Knowledge of the truth of the premises and linguistic understanding, by themselves, together, but by themselves, do not give us knowledge of the truth of the conclusion. More precisely, knowing that the conclusion C is true is a new piece of knowledge, if and only if, first, understanding the premises P1, Pn, knowing that the premises P1, Pn are true, understanding the conclusion C, and then bringing all this together, thinking P1, Pn, and C at the same time. All this is not sufficient to know that C is true. additional epistemic ingredient is necessary. An epistemic ingredient beyond linguistic understanding. So according to this analysis of usefulness, you perhaps would agree that a fruitful inference is in some sense synthetic, because in order to establish the connection between the premises and the conclusion, linguistic understanding is not enough. So one needs some ingredients beyond linguistic understanding, in other words, beyond our mere grasp of the concepts. Then, so that is a possible explanation of what it means to say that an inference is useful. What about legitimacy? Well, if you read the justification of deduction, it is rather clear that legitimacy is this: an inference I is legitimate if and only if, when confronted with I, the person who accepts the premises is compelled to accept the conclusion. So validity is not enough, because an inference may be valid and no one knows it. So the problem, so legitimate is the same as compelling, and the problem is, how can a deductive inference be compelling? How can we have the experience of being compelled by deductive reasoning? In some passages of the logical basis of metaphysics, there is a hint, a suggestion towards the beginning of an answer, which is this: an inference is legitimate if and only if we recognize it as valid. That Pravitz in some recent, Damet has this verb, to recognize. That Pravitz in some recent writings uses the verb to see. I think Damet would accept also this verb. So we can say that inference I is compelling, and so legitimate, to a person P, if and only if P sees that I is valid. Okay, then we can ask, what is the relation between legitimacy and usefulness? Is there really a tension? Let's go back to usefulness. So usefulness was this: an inference I is useful if and only if, by appreciating I, a person acquires new knowledge to the effect that the conclusion is true. We have explained in what sense it is a new knowledge, but we haven't explained appreciating. What is appreciating? But now there is a clear answer to this question. To appreciate an inference I is to see that I is valid. But if, so this is, I think, a plausible answer, and then it has interesting consequences, because now we can say that an inference I is useful if and only if, by seeing that I is valid, a person acquires new knowledge to the effect that the conclusion is true. And the consequence is that there is an interesting relation between usefulness and legitimacy, because usefulness is a particular kind of legitimacy then. A useful deductive inference is a particular kind of legitimate deductive inference, because a legitimate deductive inference is an inference such that we see that it is valid. It is a legitimate deductive inference which is legitimate not only in virtue of an understanding of premises and conclusion, but also on the basis of an additional epistemic ingredient that I haven't explained yet. And then there are two kinds of legitimate inferences. Inferences such that we see that I is valid immediately on the basis of only one ingredient. Here, knowledge of the meanings of premises and conclusion is this one ingredient, so linguistic understanding is sufficient. We might say these are analytic inferences. And then there is another kind of legitimate inferences such that we see that the inference I is valid on the basis of two ingredients: knowledge of the meanings of premises and conclusion, and an additional ingredient that I have not explained yet. The second kind of inferences are those that are useful. And the first kind of inferences, they are legitimate, but in Damet's sense of epistemic fruitfulness, they are not useful. They are legitimate but not useful in this epistemic sense. So in both cases, legitimacy is based on meaning. For Dament, the basis of the compelling force of inference is faithfulness to meaning. There is this quotation which is clear. An inference is compelling just because, presented with it, we cannot resist the passage from premises to conclusion without being unfaithful to the meanings we have already given to the expression, to the expressions employed in it. So, faithfulness to meaning, but there are two ways of being faithful to meanings. And now we can understand why in this essay, The Justification of Deduction, Dament says that the problem of deductive inference can be formulated in another way. What way? Another way of expressing the perplexity to which the existence of deductive inference gives rise is by asking how it can come about that we have an indirect means for recognizing the truth of a statement. So, here there is another dichotomy between direct verification and indirect verification. A direct verification is a verification, Dament explains, such that if we know the meaning of a verified statement, we know that it can be verified in that way. So the condition fixing what counts as a direct verification is meaning constitutive. An indirect verification is not, the notion of an indirect verification is not meaning constitutive, because though we understand the conclusion, we don't know that it can be verified in that way. This is, we will discover it perhaps, but it doesn't depend only on our understanding of the conclusion. Clearly, since most verifications are inferential, this is a general case. A very important particular case is the distinction between direct inference and indirect inference. Direct inferences are meaning constitutive and indirect inferences are not meaning constitutive. This dichotomy is the same as the one between the two kinds of legitimate inferences. You see, the possibility of establishing the statement directly must be envisaged by anyone who grasps the meaning of the statement. So here the meaning of the statement, grasp of the meaning is sufficient. The possibility of establishing it by indirect means need not be. So in some cases we can understand, we grasp the meaning of the conclusion, but we don't know that it can be verified indirectly. Something else is necessary. Another epistemic ingredient is necessary. So, then an inference I can be legitimate in two ways. Legitimate or compelling in two ways. It can be legitimate but not useful, and it can be legitimate and useful. In the first case it is a direct inference, in the second case it is an indirect inference. And that explains why he says this in this essay. The problematic case, so the case where we have an inference that is both legitimate and useful, is that in which a statement is established indirectly, even though conclusively. So now we can reformulate the problem of deductive inference in this way. How can an indirect inference be legitimate? So how can we see that an indirect inference is valid? Clearly, I have told there are two ingredients, epistemic and so linguistic understanding, and this additional ingredient. And that is the real problem then. So a crucial related question is this. What is the further epistemic ingredient added to our linguistic understanding that allows us to recognize the validity of an indirect inference? And now, in the fifth part, I give Damet's solution, Damet's proposed solution. There are 4 steps. The first important step is this, that Damet says in many places that every verification of a statement S requires recognition of a characteristic pattern. Every verification. So, observational or inferential. It is a mistake to think that To verify also an observational statement, no more is required than an exposure to the relevant sense impressions. Also for observational statements, the verification always demands the recognition of a pattern. But of course, there is a distinction between direct verifications, meaning constitutive, and indirect verifications. In the first case, this is step 2, an ability to discern the characteristic pattern pi of a direct verification of a statement S, and in particular of a direct inference whose conclusion is S. This, it is a direct verification, so it is part of our understanding of S. If we understand the sentence, we know that it can be verified by that pattern. But for indirect verifications, it is different. An ability to discern the characteristic pattern sigma of an indirect verification of a statement S, so of an indirect inference whose conclusion is S, is not part of an understanding of S. And he gives many examples, but the most effective is Euler's famous solution of the problem of the bridges at Königsberg. And so Euler's solution allows us to see that a certain indirect inference is valid. So the indirect inference is more or less this. During her walk, Jane has crossed every bridge in Königsberg. Premise. Conclusion. Jane has crossed at least one of the bridges, at least twice. So clearly, if you consider the observation of the entire walk, you have some sense impressions, but the patterns corresponding to a verification of the premise and the pattern corresponding to the verification of the conclusion, though the sense impressions are the same, the patterns are different. To recognize either proposition as true would be to discern one or another pattern in the complex of perceptions which would make up observations of the entire walk. And an ability to recognize patterns of direct verifications is part of linguistic understanding. So for both premise and conclusion, we have a direct verification and patterns corresponding to direct verification. So the premise is directly verified by pattern sigma, and an ability to see this is part of linguistic understanding, and the conclusion would be directly verified by pattern pi, and an ability to see this is part of linguistic understanding. But if we make the inference, we don't have a direct verification of the conclusion. So we make the inference, we verify the conclusion through the inference, and this is an indirect way. So, because we haven't verified directly by means of observation the conclusion. So why do we accept this conclusion? Because we have a proof. And the proof is convincing because it displays, Dammit says, a means whereby we can effectively transform any representation of the root by means of which the one pattern might be displayed, the pattern corresponding to the premise, into one representation of the root by means of which the other will be displayed. So the pattern corresponding to the conclusion. So the proof allows a pattern of transformation to be seen. So we have a pattern sigma for the premise, pattern pi for the conclusion. They are the direct patterns, let us say. And the proof shows a means of transforming the one into the other. So the proof gives another pattern, pattern psi, of transformation of sigma into pi. Deductive inference reveals a higher order pattern, a pattern that relates different patterns to one another, which is pattern psi. So the proof displays a pattern psi of transformation of sigma into pi. We can formulate it like this: a pattern psi of transformation of direct verifications of the premises into a direct verification of the conclusion. And the reductions for elimination inferences in natural deduction, by means of which dark privates prove the normalization theorems, are special transformations of this kind. They have this characteristic. It's only a particular case. So step 4 is this, that an ability to see that an indirect inference whose conclusion is S is deductively valid consists in an ability to discern in a direct verification of the premises a certain pattern sigma. This is part of linguistic understanding. And secondly, seeing that sigma can be transformed into the characteristic pattern pi of a direct verification of the conclusion S. And this is the additional epistemic ingredient. So, we can say that there is a notion of damned compelling inference for a speaker, which can be defined more or less like this. An inference I is damned compelling for P if and only if either I is meaning constitutive and P understands the relevant words. This is the analytically compelling. Or I is not meaning constitutive, P understands the relevant words and possesses the necessary additional ingredient. What does this mean? Is this. So P possesses the necessary additional ingredient for an indirect damned compelling inference I if and only if P sees that the pattern sigma of direct verifications of the premises can be transformed into the pattern pi of a direct verification of the conclusion of I. And in other places he says P possesses a method for transforming sigma into pi. So this is Dammet's solution. So if there is time, now I have some short critical remarks.
Yeah.
So very shortly, I have these 3 critical remarks. The first is this, that there are meaning constitutive inferences that are not compelling. So Dammet assumes that, so accepts always an inference from, the inference is meaning constitutive. From this premise one can conclude that the inference is compelling and valid, of course, because compelling means that we see that it is valid in virtue of our knowledge of meaning. I think this is not true, because the meaning-giving activity is fallible. So, why? Because a fragment of language can be rationally criticized in a given epistemic situation by speakers who understand it. So an epistemic community can rationally reject the fragment of language containing the words of which an inference is meaning constitutive. There are many examples of this. For example, you can imagine there is an inference P constitutive of the meaning of schizophrenia. And some psychiatrists adopt this concept, but other psychiatrists reject it. And then B is not compelling for those who reject the language of schizophrenia, though they understand it. So a meaning constitutive inference can be without compelling force. Second critical remark is that there are meaning constitutive inferences that are not meaning constitutive in Dammet's sense. So the requirement that the meaning constitutive inference should be compelling forces Dammet to adopt a very restrictive notion of meaning constitutive inference. But I think that the right attitude to detect what inferences are meaning constitutive is to follow this regulative idea that meaning constitutive is what speakers treat as meaning constitutive. And the meaning-giving activity is freer than Dammet thinks. So he poses very restrictive conditions on the form of a meaning constitutive inference I to have a guarantee that it is compelling, which is this. I is an instance of an introduction rule which can be specified in terms of sentences of lower complexity than the conclusion. More or less it is this. But many inferences or assertions violate Dammet's restrictive conditions, but are treated as meaning constitutive. So I think that Dammet's notion is too restrictive. The third remark concerns Dammet compelling inferences. I think there are compelling deductive inferences that are not compelling according to Dammet. Imagine a rational community that accepts a syllogism. You can imagine this community in Middle Age. The syllogism is every human is an animal, every philosopher is a human, therefore every philosopher is an animal. And this inference is addressed to the human audience in the context C. That it's a rational community. This inference stands up to all epistemically virtuous objections raised in the context C. So it is compelling for them. It stands up to all epistemically virtuous objections raised in the context C. It is compelling, but the members of the community, middle age, are not implicitly aware of a method for transforming the verification of the premises into a direct verification of the conclusion. So they should know Pravitz's reductions to do that. So it is not Dammet compelling. So it is compelling, but it is not Dammet compelling. So the conclusions I am inclined to draw are these, that Dammet adopts a too restrictive, I think there are many interesting ideas in Dammet's approach to this issue, but he adopts a too restrictive conception of meaning constitutive inferences and of compelling inferences, and a wider concept of fallible meaning constitutive inference, and a wider concept of contextually compelling inference, because that inference was compelling in the context of that community, would be more adequate to our inferential practice.
Yes, just a bit of information. You gave concrete examples of your first objection and your third. Could you give a concrete example of the second one, where meaning constituted inferences that are not meaning constituted?
Yes.
Concrete example.
They may.
The topic is so abstract.
For example, consider the axioms of some theory. So one can introduce some concepts by giving some axioms. They have not usually the form of introduction rules in Dammet's sense, specified compositionally. Because Dammet has the idea that, in a way, the form of the direct inferences, so the meaning constitutive inferences, should mirror the way in which the meaning of a sentence is determined by its components. So it should be compositional. And the premises should be, also the assumptions discharged, they all should be of lower complexity, or in some cases of equal complexity, but never of higher complexity of the conclusion. So this is a very narrow notion of a rule. If you give some axioms, any axioms, and say these concepts are defined by these axioms, then you don't satisfy this requirement of compositionality or molecularity, as he calls it. Then there are some examples of elimination rules that can be considered meaning constitutive. For example, double negation elimination. Many authors have considered double negation elimination constitutive of the meaning of negation. But double negation elimination doesn't satisfy the requirements that Dammet poses. Even modus ponens. Modus ponens is very reasonable to say that modus ponens is meaning constitutive for conditional. But for Dammit, it is valid, of course, but it is not meaning constitutive. We have, so the meaning of the conditional is given by conditional introduction. So you assume, and then you can show, because there is a special reduction, that when you have a direct verification of the premises of modus ponens, then you can obtain, through the reduction, a direct verification of the conclusion of modus ponens. But you have to know this in order to validate modus ponens, which is in itself not meaning constitutive. And then there is another, I think there are also other examples, because the examples I have given are considered correct by those who adopt these rules. But then there are also, as I said, some meaning constitutive inferences that are, we realize that they are wrong. One can say that, for example, the naive comprehension principle for the notion of set, Cantorian notion of set, was meaning constitutive of what a set is. But that, of course, isn't meaning constitutive for Dammit, because meaning constitutive inference should be correct. It is not compositional in the sense, and so there are a lot of, so when we try to give meaning to a certain word, we fix some certain rules of use, but we don't know in advance that they are correct. We can discover later that they are wrong. And all these wouldn't be meaning constitutive for Dammit, precisely because they are wrong.
Thanks for your clear, exposition of Dammit's approach to the problem, which is really, very, very complex, and so this is a great help to understand Dammit's point of view. Still, when Dammit introduces the recognition that a certain pattern is valid, or Pravitz, and says, we see it is valid, but these are unknown, these are primitive notions. What does it mean to see? Seems to me that we use a word of which we know nothing.
Well, the idea is that we know something, but of course, Pravitz says that to see, this use of the word to see is a metaphor.
Yeah, okay.
It's a metaphor. And he tries to explain this metaphor by providing, as you know, a whole theory of grounds.
Yes.
So he has this theory of grounds and operations on grounds. This should be an explanation of this metaphor. But anyway, apart from that, we have some ideas about these notions. It's the idea that it is some epistemic relation. So we realize, we see, we recognize, in somehow immediately, that that is valid. For example, because we know the meanings. Because if we accept Dammit's view, when we grasp the meanings of some expressions, we thereby can see that some inferences are valid, just in virtue of our grasp of the meanings. I don't think so, as I said before, because I think it is a fallible activity. But Dammit accepts this idea of analytical validity, so that if we grasp the meaning, thereby we see that some inferences involving those words, not all, but some, are valid. And that is to recognize.
So yes, interesting, but a bit complicated. So I wanted to ask you, can you say more words about the same problem applied to the non-deductive inferences in the Dammit's terms, and how can you translate to the common experience in Dammit's conceptual words, that the common experience that we have every day when you tell another person syllogistic reasoning or the reductio ad absurdum, and the other person doesn't recognize anything, because she usually uses as meaning constitutive fallacies or other kinds of non-deductive reasoning that for them these kinds of reasoning are compelling. So they are completely meaning constitutive, but not the deductive one. Not only because they are not rational, they do not know logic, and so the fact that there is a truth-preserving rule, but also because they do not grasp from any perspective the fact that that kind of reasoning is a good reasoning from the abstract aristocratic intellectual point of view of the studies about deductive reasoning.
Well, you have two questions. The first concerning non-deductive inferences. Well, Lamed, as I said, it doesn't say very much about non-deductive inferences, but he says that for some sentences they are meaning constitutive. For example, you can, an example gives concerns pain. So you could say that the inference from Luigi moans, Luigi winces and touches his belly, you can conclude that Luigi has a stomach ache. And that, if you know what is, the idea is that if you grasp what it is to have, what it means to say that someone has a stomach ache in the third person, here it is important the distinction between third and first person, then you learn that these are the criteria for asserting that. But they are not conclusive. Because we also learn that Luigi may pretend, for example. So, then about fallacies, well, the problem here is that we are imagining a certain, this is clearly a presupposition that Lamed doesn't make explicit very much, but I think it is in the background, and I think it is important to underline that. We must think that we are in a very particular kind of dialogical context, in an epistemic context, where persons aim at truth, they discuss and they have some epistemic virtues, as I say. Yes, yes. And so, it is true, for example, that if you make these famous selection task experiments, for example, with modus ponens, so they commit fallacies, the fallacy of the consequence. We have this immediate tendency to make the wrong inference. But I wouldn't say that in this framework this means that these fallacies are meaning constitutive. Okay. Because if you then begin to discuss with these people, then they realize that it is wrong. A meaning constitutive inference is an inference such that if we, in a rational dialogue, make objections and counter the objections and so on, then we reach a point where the discussion ends because the spade is turned, Wittgenstein would have said, so the bedrock. And there we say we accept it, and we don't think it is necessary to justify it. We don't even think it is possible. It's simply, it is like that. And if you don't see that, you don't understand.
Okay, any more questions? If not, Emiliano will tell you something about the break.
Yeah, because the bar is closed.